A very good day. Welcome to Agenda. My name is Regina Lay and I'm sitting in for Cito Beltran. We are One News, all sides, all the time. Now let's start off with our daily starter quotes. This time it's coming from artist Mary Engelbright. And she says, "Don't ever save anything for a special occasion. Being alive is the special occasion." And now it's time to take a look at the front pages of the Philippine Star. In his speech at the APEC CEO Summit in Thailand, President Bongbong Marcos spoke of a, quote, dark clouds looming despite the easing of pandemic restrictions. Marcos said 3 issues, food security, pandemic resilience, and climate change, have to be addressed to continue to sustain growth as the world recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic. Meanwhile, on the sidelines of that APEC Summit, Philippine leader met with Chinese President Xi Jinping for the first time. The palace did not say whether the two leaders discussed the South China Sea dispute, while Marcos himself also said that it was also more of a, quote, getting to know you meeting. In other news, Justice Chief Boying Remulla told a United Nations body that there are no state-sponsored attacks or intimidation against members of the media and the legal profession. Remulla said this in Geneva, Switzerland, before the UN Human Rights Council, which is currently running its 4th cycle of Universal Periodic Review of the Philippines. And on the killing of radio broadcaster Percy Lapid, suspended Bureau of Corrections Director General Gerald Bantag said he is ready to attend the preliminary investigation. However, Bantag also made it clear that he would defer to his lawyer's advice. Recall that Bantag is facing murder charges along with several other suspects. And lastly, customers of Manila Water and Maynilad Water Services should brace for an increase in water rates starting next year. This as the Metropolitan Waterworks and Sewerage System, or MWSS, approved the outward adjustment for their mandatory rate rebasing. Now let's get on to the conversations for the day. President Bongbong Marcos, as we said on Thursday, held a bilateral meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the 29th APEC Summit, this time being held in Bangkok, Thailand. What does this mean in terms of countries' relations with China and the US? Let's find out from our guest today. We have Professor Eric de Torres from the UE Political Science Department. Professor, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I just have to fix my background. Thank you very much, Regina. Thank you for having me.
That's all right, Professor. Take your time. Again, we are talking about this all-important bilateral meeting that that President Marcos was able to secure with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Okay, there you go. Sorry for that. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's get into it. And I wanted to first point out that, before the meeting, Marcos kept saying that he will bring up the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea issue, right? He was adamant about it.
Yeah.
However, in the official statement afterwards, there was no mention at all of WPS, the West Philippine Sea, and all we know is that they mostly talked about Marcos's state visit to China in January of next year. What did you make of all of that?
Well, Regina, this is really the thing about looking at the consideration, especially the delicacy of the situation, considering that Vice President Kamala Harris will also visit the Philippines. So I think it's really more of a confidence and a consensus building. Right now, as it is, and for me, and this is something that is unconventional and thinking out of the box. It's really, I think, the positioning of the president in the country is looking at it from a perspective of being able to get the best of both worlds. And I'm sure the impact of there's really an impact on the part, on the perspective of the Chinese, that allowing and Philippines welcoming Vice President Kamala Harris, okay, in the country. So that alone signals something that is actually very important, because right now, as it is, the president is only still have at least just 6 months in the office, or not being able to finish the year. Just got elected in May 2022. And I think that the Chinese, or the Chinese government, or China for that matter, are still in the process of, to a certain degree, to a certain extent, assessing the foreign policy of the Philippines, especially with this administration, because we also have to consider that from the past administration, President Duterte back then was very particular about, establishing very good diplomatic ties, and veering towards, establishing a more friendly Philippines to China, despite the issue of the West Philippine Sea. So I think really, Regina, the focus primarily, and I don't think that he will be able to bring it up to the table, especially the issue of the West Philippine Sea, considering that the challenge right now that we have is very economic. I think the manner by which how they discuss is what cooperation, may it be may it be from a security, may it be from whatever perspective that might be, that Philippines can collaborate and would benefit basically from China for that matter.
So you don't think the president, to put it bluntly, is going to get a chance to raise the South China Sea dispute to President Xi Jinping?
Perhaps on a closed door meeting. Definitely, it's really a top level, or an executive, or between two leaders, really, as it is, because
Right.
it's going to be a very delicate situation right now, or as it is.
Right. I asked because this week has been, there's been so many diplomatic events this week, right? Now, prior to that APEC summit, there was also the ASEAN summit in Cambodia. And now, during that summit, President Marcos was also there, and he also said that he, in fact, raised the issue of the South China Sea Code of Conduct in his speech. And he said it was more urgent now than ever to get it done. Remember that the foundation of the Code of Conduct has been in the works for 20 years, 2 decades now, right?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, he also didn't get much of a response from ASEAN, right? After that speech, after that summit, he said, look, there's been no progress on the Code of Conduct. So again, when you combine all of these developments together, are we looking at a stalemate once more as far as the South China Sea is concerned? Do we just, put it on the back burner again because of more pressing economic issues?
For me personally, Regina, that is really the primordial consideration here, because the challenge right now, as it is economic in nature. Because right now, as it is, the way that we intend to look at the forecast for next year is going to be very difficult. And one of the pressing challenge that that lies ahead this administration is how do we intend to basically stabilize the prices of basic commodities, lower down the inflation rates, high in unemployment and underemployment. So basically, everything that has something to do, Regina, with the economy and basically the quality of life of the Filipinos is going to be the very challenge of this administration. I also would like to look at it from a perspective that President Marcos can be a champion because of his good, very much eloquent, and he has this way of dealing with state leaders. But we could relatively see in Cambodia during the meeting and during the summit is that some of the countries are actually quite passive. They have their own internal challenges as well. But I think it's a collaborate, or it's a situation that is given to most Southeast Asian countries, that the challenge would be more of the economic. How do we intend to get our feet back? How do we intend to keep our economy running? How do we stabilize oil? So it's going to be very challenging. So the mode or the approach that we intend to go about it is that really more of collaboration, multilateral approach in terms of looking at it as such. But I think that President Marcos can be a champion to really propel and really push for the code of conduct. So it's going to be a game changer, especially if the Philippines would spearhead this campaign or approach in being able to get the job done.
Yeah, and sadly, though, it doesn't seem like there's consensus at this point in time among the ASEAN nations, right, as to what to
Yeah.
do with the code of conduct moving forward. It's like you said, everyone has, some countries are more passive because, vested interests. Everyone has their own problems. Everyone's just focused on their domestic issues, right? And this beast of a problem is, not something that they're prioritizing at the moment. Um, you brought up the visit of U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris in just a few days. In fact, she is coming from November 20 to the 22nd. And the Philippines is only the second country she's visiting in Southeast Asia, the first being Thailand for the APEC Summit. And then, of course, the Philippines. But most interesting there, I find, is apart from the fact that she has scheduled meetings with President Marcos and Vice President Sara Duterte, is that she's also slated to travel to Puerto Princesa in Palawan. Talk us through the significance of that, Professor.
Well, it's very significant because number one, it's really confidence building on the part of the United States and the Philippines. Of course, United States is wanted to play its card that despite of the previous administrations being pro-Chinese, they're testing the waters as to what extent they could probably engage Philippines for that matter, especially with this administration. So I think if we play our cards well, Regina, we could get the best of both worlds. But it's also kind of difficult and very challenging as well on the part. But I think that the president can do it because of his way. He is very eloquent, and he's very diplomatic as well. And I think it's also one way of promoting tourism in our country. Puerto Princesa is actually one of the areas or places of tourism site that we could probably really be proud of. So I think we could capitalize on her visit to encourage tourism and more Americans visiting basically the country and so on and so forth.
That's a great idea, but primarily what you're saying is that this visit to Puerto Princesa in Palawan is a demonstration of Washington's commitment to back the Philippines in case of a South China Sea dispute. Is that right?
Yes, definitely, definitely. It's a confidence building on the part of the U.S. and the Philippines. It's like rest assured that whatever happens, U.S. will be there. But of course, to a certain degree, to a certain extent, that would significantly change if there would be a change in administration also in the United States. But as far as the Democrats or the administration of Joe Biden is concerned, he really wanted to, establish still very good and strong diplomatic relations with our country, especially with this administration.
You're right, because VP Harris is only the second, well, she is the most senior official to come visit the Philippines since President Trump himself during the ASEAN summit way back in, I would say, 2017, right? So that counts for a lot. This idea that you brought up of a win-win situation, which is I find that quite interesting, but I can see where the pitfalls may be as well. So
Yeah.
the narrative there is the Marcos administration is obviously proving friendlier to China whilst revitalizing the relationship with the US, with Washington. Um, of course, we would love to have it both ways, right? We would love to have a win-win situation, but how could it go wrong?
Well, of course, with how we intend to actually go to one country to that of the other, especially if the offer or the agreement between, for example, both countries would be difficult on the part of the decision making, on the part of the president. Secondly, for example, if there would be an aggressive stance on the part of the United States in being able to, revise some of the provisions of the visiting forces agreement, let's say, and
Mm,
and of course, the manner by which they will be able to allow us to sit
mm,
to get hold of military technology that they actually sell in the market. So that would really be a game changer because for me, Regina, as it is, the manner by which Vice President Kamala Harris would visit us already sends a strong signal on the part of China. So
mm,
I really think that, of course it would be very difficult to guess what of course President Xi Jinping and President Marcos talked about, and I'm sure they had a closed door meeting of some sort to really some very important negotiations between two countries. So again, it's just a matter of what areas that these two countries can actually offer to the Philippines for that matter.
Professor Eric, I think you're right. It's there's this dynamics between these two major superpowers, right? And in fact, I might point out that after that bilateral meeting with President Marcos, President Xi Jinping issued a statement, and in it there was a line that made people sit up and take notice. And he said, "The Asia Pacific it is no one's backyard and should not become an arena for big power contests." I already saw the headlines from out of the US, and Western pundits are already calling it a thinly veiled attempt at warning Washington over meddling in the South China Sea. What's your take on this?
Well, of course, it would significantly depend, and this time because of course Joe Biden is, of course, the Democrats, they have their own positioning. The Democrats are very particular about revitalizing its diplomatic relations with Southeast Asian nations, in specifically Philippines, because we can really feel the complete opposite of the Trump administration as
Mm,
compared to the Biden administration. That the Trump administration is that he has this way of live and let live. Non-interventionist is the approach of
mm,
Donald Trump. But as
mm,
compared to the Democrat or Joe Biden's administration, is that revitalizing and establishing very good diplomatic relations, establishing its position in the Southeast Asian region, in the ASEAN region, in the Pacific, basically, is very important to be able to at least neutralize the situation so as to prevent also the dominance militarily of China for that matter. So it's going to be very interesting, but of course we also have to factor in to consider that there is the elections in the US is also just around the corner. We'll never know if who will be the contender of the Republicans. So again,
well,
we will wait.
former President Donald Trump has already thrown his hat in the ring, so baka we might swing back that way.
Yeah, if of course this is something that is of consideration, really, that a lot of some of the countries really were to a certain degree, to a certain extent, appreciate President Donald Trump because of the non-interventionist approach. as compared to the previous administrations that, the conventional manner or approach of the US of, establishing good diplomatic relations, maintaining, its hold to various parts of the country. But, some really appreciate because, of again, at the end of the day, it's a question of sovereignty, Regina, of
Mm.
how, one country can be able to pursue its foreign policy independently of any other country. And of course, we cannot discount the fact that we have a long-standing history with the United States. But I think also the previous administration, the Duterte administration, opened possibilities that we could basically get the best of both worlds from whatever country. It's really the essence of pursuing a very independent foreign policy for that matter. So it can be done. We were able to establish a relationship with Russia, with China, and these are non-conventional countries that for many years we are very particular about US as the number one superpower or
Right.
developed country that would always aid Philippines for that matter.
But I would have to disagree there because I think the Duterte administration did turn us away from Washington, which is our sole treaty ally, right? I mean,
Yeah,
President Duterte made no secret of the fact that he,
yeah,
well, you know, has no warm feelings towards the US. He refused to step foot in the
yeah,
US for any sort of
yeah,
visit. And it just was not cordial at all throughout his term. Um,
yeah.
my last question to you is, do you think there's any significance to the fact that President Marcos's first state visit outside of Southeast Asia is going to be China, and that's coming up in January 2023. Although I have to also point out that he is planning state visits to the US next year as well. But the first one outside Southeast Asia is China. Do you think there's any significance to that?
Not really, but for me, it's really again both countries. If we try to look at a more profound perspective, both countries really wanting to win Philippines. Really wanting to win Philippines. They're also wanting to test waters of where this administration will anchor. Again, as what I would like to reiterate, it's just a matter of how we would intend to play our cards well. And secondly, to give emphasis or focus to key areas, especially on food security. This is really a pressing problem for us. Importation of oil. How do we intend to stabilize basically oil that would somehow had significant effect or impact with all of almost everything happening to our country, job opportunities and employment for our OFW. So again, for me, it has no significance at all whether China or the US. I think that both countries really would like to win this administration and would have wanting to have a feel where this administration really would be anchoring in or anchoring at.
It sounds like such a nice position to be in, you know.
Yeah,
Professor
yeah.
Eric Daniel de Torres of the UE Political Science Department, we thank you so much for your time and insights this morning.
Thank you very
Agenda
much.
will pause for a quick breakdown, but we'll be right back. Keep it here in One News, all sides, all the time. Welcome back to Agenda. I'm Regina Lay. As we were just saying, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas hiked interest rates up by 75 basis points as expected at their last meeting. This as they continue to try to control the impact of inflation and match the aggressive action of the U.S. Federal Reserve. To talk more about this, we have two guests with us, esteemed guests with us this morning, I should say. First up, we've got economist and Professor Emmanuel Leyco of the Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Maynila. And we also have RCBC Chief Economist Michael Ricafort. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good morning and thank you, Regina and everyone.
Professor, I think you're still muted, but I'll let you jump in anytime you want. So let's get right into it, right? 75 basis points, that's not coming as a surprise. They highlighted that, they flagged that weeks ago. Do we breathe a sigh of relief now, right? I mean, this takes the benchmark rate to 5%, amongst the highest in many years. But at least the peso depreciation has slowed down. So can we now breathe a sigh of relief? Let's go with you first, Professor Leyco, and then back to Michael.
Well, like you said, the peso is staying not making anybody nervous at the moment. And yet the interest rate is going up. The U.S. interest rates gone up. So it's like, did we increase the interest rate too early? If our purpose is to stabilize the peso, it looks like without the interest rate going up, it was already doing its job. So I'm not sure. I think the timeliness of the interest rate action by the Bangko Sentral may not be timely. I would have thought that they could have waited a little bit and see if the interest rate will be needed to be brought up.
That's an interesting perspective. What do you think, Mike? Is the timing of it sound?
Well, based on the signaling, looks like there's urgency to do so. Well, first, we have, on a positive note, this is one of, the most transparent ever when it comes to signaling and the iteration on the widely expected 75 basis point hike. So that's matching the Fed to 5%. That's the highest in nearly 4 years, or since December of 2018, when it was at 5.5%. And the signals have been clear also that the local policy rates, it could still be increased further and match any future Fed rate hikes, thereby maintaining interest rate differentials. And based on the statements yesterday by the local monetary officials, so it has been made clear there that these are, of course, exceptional times. The need to be very transparent and very clear in the communications. The objective of which primarily is to help stabilize both the peso exchange rate and overall inflation. So it was even made clear further by signaling that, of course, under normal circumstances, this won't necessarily be the case. Because had it not been for the external developments that we encountered since the start of the year, the communication may have been not that direct and not that straightforward in terms of signaling. It's practically giving away to everybody else. But that's good. Transparency has been good for the country. This is unprecedented, and that would help many businesses. It would create greater stability, order in not just in the financial markets, but in the overall economy, facilitating better planning for economic players, whether they're consumers, businesses, most especially, and other institutions.
Right. So it sounds like you think that yeah, they should stay the course. The interesting thing though is that we keep talking about how it's meant to bring down inflation, but we saw the latest numbers, right? It's still at 7.7%, still a near 14-year high. And when you break down the numbers, you'll see that consumers are still spending despite the really high inflation. BSP Governor Medalla was asked at the meeting yesterday whether or not he thinks that inflation could go higher in the last 2 months of the year, and he said something like he would bet a lot that it will not go beyond 8%. What do you think, Professor Leyco?
Well, actually, where I was coming from when I said that the timeliness of the interest rate hike would be perhaps questionable at this point was that inflation continued to go up despite the interest rate hikes that we saw earlier. And if ever, the interest rate action by the Bangko Sentral was really meant to defend the peso. But it looked like basing it on the action from the foreign exchange market, it didn't matter that the peso, the interest rate on the peso was not as high or did not move when the U.S. interest rate increased last week. So I was thinking, is the Bangko Sentral exhausting its monetary policy action this early? Remember, interest rate is not a benign action. It will create a lot of impact on the market. So, for example, in the credit market, interest rate hike will make make capital more expensive, and it could also actually forestall any more action by the market or by the producers. Just like what Mike was saying, it creates a signal, and it actually sends a very clear signal that the interest rate is something that the Bangko Sentral is not going to let go. But I thought that letting go or tapping the interest rate this early may exhaust the effectiveness of BSP action. And remember, when you increase interest rate, it's actually the government or the Bangko Sentral promising that I will pay you higher interest revenues, and that could also affect the ability of the Bangko Sentral to pay interest expense in the future. Remember, it has happened before. Bangko Sentral is not exactly a company or an institution that will be able to print money at will. No, it cannot. So I would have thought that more prudence would have been practiced or observed when the Bangko Sentral exercised its interest rate policy intervention. Not necessarily holding back forever, but I thought that we could have watched. Inflation rate continued to go up despite the earlier increases, and the peso seems to be strengthening, relatively, despite the lack of interest rate movement immediately after the U.S. increased its interest rate. Okay. So would that continue? I hope not. I think the interest rate should be held back at the moment, and inflation rate be watched closer, and the peso movement in the currency market be vigilantly monitored.
I see what you mean, Professor, because especially since the U.S. Fed has already begun signaling that they may start slowing down the rate hikes, right? I see what you're saying, that we could have maybe waited another cycle to see how the markets go before being very reactive. Mike, any strong objections to that?
Well, the inflation would peak possibly within this quarter, because we have yet to see the full impact of tropical storm Paeng on agricultural products, especially food, especially in hard hit areas. So there may still be some pickup in the prices of food, come especially for November. And of course, the holiday season. There's always every year, regardless of the economic conditions. For the past 20, 30 or so years, there's a seasonal pickup in demand and prices do follow, only to go down after the holiday season in December. So by January. So there's a possible peak, but we could see, well, at least some improvement in the inflation data starting the first quarter because that was the peak of global oil prices at the early part of the war at $130 for the NYMEX oil. Now, NYMEX oil is down to the $80 levels lately. So therefore, year-on-year reckoning on inflation would start to ease starting by that time. But of course, that's just part of the equation. There are also, well, we have to recognize that wage hikes in the country and transport fare hikes took effect June to July mostly, and some residual another round of transport fare hikes in October, plus the second round inflation effect. So in the latter part of the year, we may see already some easing of the year-on-year inflation. That's the biggest story in the world since last week. Well, at least U.S. inflation already eased to 7.7% year-on-year. That's the lowest since January or since before the war, Russia-Ukraine war started in February, and that's consistent with global oil prices also among 9-month lows. So yeah, that's a leading indicator. It's going to go there, yes. That's why the dollar has gone down already since last week, since Friday, exactly a week ago. Well, it changed the story actually. That would well, at the very least, it would lessen the urgency for, say, further rate hikes. But nonetheless, of course, year to date, the peso is still, well, it came from 51, now it's at 57 levels. Realistically, there could still be some inflationary impact. So therefore, and yeah, the signal also is to match any future Fed rate hikes. And the expectation now, by December 14, another 50 basis point hike is. So we need to be pragmatic and circumspect about it, that there may still be a need to manage and to help better stabilize and manage the peso and overall inflation in the process in view of that context. So yeah, there's some, definitely realistically there would be some pain in terms of higher interest rate costs for consumers, for businesses, and for institutions.
Mike, I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you say that you think that second round effects of inflation have already kicked in or not yet?
Well, they have kicked in already. Actually, it's already part of the lagging indicators. In fact, the leading indicators are global commodity prices. They have started to ease. I'm talking about global crude oil prices and wheat, soybean. They have erased all their increases since the start of the war. They're now at the lowest level since late January, even before the war started. The war started between Russia and Ukraine February 24, and other commodity prices as leading indicators, they've already gone down, like steel, industrial metals like copper, nickel. They have gone down already to their lowest levels in 2 years since November 2020, because central banks have done a great job. The central banks around the world, they have tightened. Yes, they have raised interest rates. Yes, it tightened. There's a risk of recession. That's an unintended consequence. In their quest to bring down inflation back to the target in the US, back to the target of 2%. Because if inflation is not managed, it's going to spiral. It's going to run away. That's why even if it would mean risk of recession, they would do that. They would bite the bullet and take that sacrifice, just like what's happening now around the world, not just in the US but also here locally with the recent the string of rate hikes.
I'm glad you brought up the risk of recession, because last night the headline out of the UK was that they think they're already in recession. The European Commission also said they will fall into a recession by winter this year. And also, of course, the US has already long said that they're in for a hard landing. So with the prospect of a global recession on the horizon, how should the Philippines prepare for that, Professor Leyco?
Well, I think in a global recession, the hardest hit will be the poor people. Small business sector. And I think the policy interventions by the Bangko Sentral right now will have long-lasting implication on how the people will be able to comply with it or to cope with it. And I think when we look at the inflationary numbers, this is mostly consumer or consumption driven. And when we look at consumption, food is the most highly affected. In fact, inflation for food is much higher than the 7.7% that was reported. And it only, to me, reflected the futility of interest rate movement in arresting inflation. So when we move to bring interest rates higher, I always go back to, so what happened when interest rate went up from 2% and now to almost 5% in the overnight repo? What would be the threshold that we can hold and say that interest rate increases should already be capped and no more increases? And I think that is not only inflationary, and it can even bring recession to the Philippines. Earlier, we were looking at how recession will look like. If you remember what happened to us during the height of the pandemic, our economy went down, contracted by 16.5%. And if inflation continues, higher prices, this will be the new pandemic that we will have to deal with, where the people not able to cope with increasing prices that will include our consumers, that will include our producers. Recession will really likely to happen in the Philippines. Now, what can we do? What kind of social safety nets, if ever, would be available for the people? So, for example, the most logical thing would be, would there be any worker subsidy or worker stimulus, production stimulus that the government may be able to distribute or give to the people? Looks like the budget is about to be passed, and it didn't sound like there is a recession defensive programs that are in place. Basically, we're looking at a budget that sounded more like a budget as business as usual. So I think while it may be a little bit late at this point to look at the budget, the government will really have to take the specter of a global recession happening in the Philippines, which will hit us really hard, to be considered. Right now, I didn't see that in the budget.
Professor, what does it mean to recalibrate the budget to make it more defensive? Where should we take money from, and where should we move it to?
Some people I talked to already said immediately take out the defensive, the intelligence fund.
Confidential funds.
Confidential fund, which are in the billions. That could be the first step. But I think we have to go beyond that. I think there are projects in the infrastructure or in other projects of the government that in the past did not move. Why are we going to put more money in it this year? So I think the budget will really have to be looked at. And I think we have to credit the senators and legislators for spending a lot of time scrutinizing every item in the budget. But it didn't sound like we were preparing for a economic pandemic, so to speak. That like other countries in Europe, in the US, they are saying that we have to prepare, that they needed to prepare for recession. Even private sector, biggest banks in the country, in the US, and even in Europe, they're already saying that recession is going to come. We're going to get hit. It's just a matter of time. Will it happen in the first quarter, the second quarter? They are saying that looks like the only thing that is holding recession back is that there are new jobs that are being created. So they're saying that, hey, looks like we have a future that may be positive in the coming years, because jobs creation continue. However, while there are jobs creation, there are big companies who are already laying off people in the thousands. No, social media companies, Meta, even Amazon, they're
Amazon,
already
yeah.
closing,
Twitter, yeah.
And also many digital platforms, they're already abandoning their office spaces and taking advantage of the virtual office platforms that they have created during the pandemic. So the specter of global recession coming is real. And it's just that in the Philippines, we don't hear much of that recession being prepared.
Right. So we really need a war chest at this point, and that's where the budget becomes critical. And also, I see your point earlier about why we could have waited another cycle for the interest rate hike. Because as we know, these interest rate hikes affect everything, right? Consumer loans, that's credit card loans, auto loans, home loans, consumer spending, basically, right? Mike, same question to you. How should we be preparing for the I don't know if I should say eventuality, but let's say prospect for now of a global recession?
Well, yeah, true. The leading indicator has been more than 50,000 tech jobs to be cut, those job losses. So, the U.S. recession would lead, well, that risk would lead to some slower global trade, particularly exports, investments like FDIs, and also it could have some potential adverse impact on some OFW employment. And of course, we have seen already, even a few weeks ago, some exporters, even here locally, already reducing workers, especially those in Cebu. So, yeah, well, at least from a budget perspective, it's a delicate balancing act on fiscal management because the country incurred so much debt, more than 6 trillion since the pandemic. Of course, there's already something budgeted for 200 billion pesos worth of targeted for the poorest of the poor under the conditional cash transfer platform. So that would be the intervention targeted in view of the fiscal constraints and challenges. And of course, yeah, that would be, well, given the limited funds. So that's one of the best way, rather than for everybody, giving the incentive or maybe a tax cut to everybody else, because it would be hard because of the need to actually, there's even greater urgency to raise more tax revenues in view of the need to bring down the debt to GDP ratio, currently at 63.7%. That's the highest in more than 17 years. That's still above the international threshold of 60%. Enabled to at least also the need to manage also the country's relatively favorable credit ratings at 1 to 3 notches above the minimum investment grade. So, yeah, and of course, we have seen already that at least the policies, these are well thought of, both monetary policy and fiscal policy. We have seen it bearing fruit. They have already tried the options. Say by waiting before the rate hikes, we have seen the impact on the currency a few months ago, but now it's more calculated. The peso has stabilized already since the last week of September. It was effectively capped at 59. Now it's doing at 57. So hopefully inflation would be better managed also. But it's really a balancing act as well. No? Enable to manage, of course, higher interest rates would mean higher financing costs for everybody else, not just for consumers and businesses, but also for the government. But at the same time, it's very important to manage inflation because inflation also increases the expenditures of the government. And higher interest rates at the same time would also increase the debt servicing. So it's really very important to manage all of those, as well as the impact of the peso exchange rate when it comes to the foreign debts of the country, as they are revalued to pesos. So
Right.
indeed, managing all of those dynamics. But so far, they have done a great job. Even the global central banks, they have done their work effectively by at least bringing down global commodity prices. But of course, that's a price to it. The unintended consequence is the risk of recession, just in the quest to bring down inflation. Because inflation, if that is neglected, it's gonna spiral out of control. It's gonna go up. That's why it needs managing it by the central banks, learning from the lessons of the past recession period, especially in the late 1970s to early 1980s. Because whenever there are wars, the wars that affect the prices of oil and other commodities. So that's the
Right.
equation.
Yeah.
Those are external risk factors beyond the country's control.
I see your perspective there as well, Mike. But unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. So we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Emmanuel Leyco of the Pamantasan ng Luzon ng Maynila and Mike Ricafort of RCBC. We thank you so much for your time and insights this morning, gentlemen.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
having me.
And that was today's agenda. Keep it here on Cignal TV, channels 8 and 250 for the latest news. I'm Regina Lay, sitting in for Cito Beltran. We are One News, all sides, all the time. Thank you for watching.